Hi, welcome. Today we are doing a study on Jewish theology from, I guess, a traditional perspective. We're looking at traditional Jewish sources. And right before the class, one of our students was sharing about the concept of Gerim, or resident aliens, or what in modern Judaism or even classical Judaism is considered the righteous Gentiles who become converts, and they're actually no longer Gentiles in Judaism. According to Halakha, they're considered full Jews. I have a friend who, when he was transitioning from being in these, I don't even know what to call them anymore. They're called groups who are of Jewish Christian flavor, and they appropriate Jewish ideas, or they believe that they're the ones who have the true understanding of Judaism or biblical faith. He was worried about transitioning. He found out that he had a Italian crypto-Jewish background, and he was always worried about the Noachites, what he called the Noachites. And it's really a sticky situation, because you have people who found out about crypto-Jewish background, and they have a spouse who is still part of a church, or does not feel compelled to be part of the Jewish people, or spiritually they feel that they're connected to the root of Judaism through Jesus and his teachings. So it creates this kind of conflict, because one person wants to become more committed to traditional Judaism and the other person doesn't. And we were talking about how some of the Jews who become part of the Jesus movement, they also teach that type of idea that someone can be like Ruth in the Bible, who joins the Jewish people based on her faith. And the issue comes when the Jewish community looks back at the different Gentile women who join the Jewish people, such as Sephora, the wife of Joseph, who's an Egyptian princess, Ruth. You have Rahab. There's actually a book that talks about all these women, and what's funny is that, or actually what's disturbing, is that a lot of them are of ill repute, and then somehow they're still considered to be some type of matriarchs of major Jewish heroes, such as David. I know there's nothing wrong with Ruth, but Rahab was a prostitute, and or they were part of some camp. I think Ruth was from the Moabites, and they were considered to be troublemakers because they're descendants of the daughters of Lot. So, so there's this thing about, like, how does someone join the Jewish people? And if you join the Jewish people in whatever way, my mentor and I were talking about how crypto-Jews can join the Jewish people through conversion, through return, through education, through joining a community like the one that we're trying to develop. So how do you deal with this idea of the Gentiles? And in Jewish history, righteous Gentiles, such as the people who helped Jews during the Holocaust or during the Nazi persecution, they're called Hasidei Umot Leolam. They're the righteous among the nations. So, but are they considered part of the Jewish people or of greater Israel? And that's where it gets sticky, because in Christian circles, they've come up with different terms to identify fellow Christians who are not from a Jewish background. They call all Christians Israelites, because it's about being an Israelite, it's not about being a Jew, because the kingdom of Israel now has been fulfilled in the work of Jesus and in the teaching of his disciples. They call fellow Christians of a Gentile background, they call them believers or ingrafted spiritual Jews, or there's a lot of different things that to try to kind of follow the footsteps of Paul, where non-Jews are accepted as members of the kingdom of God. And to have a kingdom, you need to have a king, and you need to have rules that govern the nation. And that's the contention that we would have, because if the kingdom was established by God through Moses, and there's certain rules that were set, and some of them were written down, and some of them were passed down through oral histories, then you come to the first century, where the Jews are struggling to keep their kingdom alive they have puppet kings like Herod and others who have been placed by the Romans. And now you have what some people believe to be the Messiah and the heir of the throne of David come, and he only talks to fellow Jews, and he only does outreach to fellow Jews, and he even talks about the lost sheep of the tribe of Israel, the tribes of Israel. And then you have one of his disciples, or one of his mystics who had an apparition of this figure of the Messiah, say that Jewish identity is good, is beautiful, is something that is passed down through the generations, but you cannot count on your identity to hold you in good standing before God. So then he talks about how the non-Jews, and there's historically, I've tried to question different historians about this, because some people say, well, the righteous Gentiles were God-fearers. And a God-fearer was someone who would go to the temple, who would go to the synagogue, who would give money to the Jewish people in their hometown, and who was considered an associate member of a synagogue or of the Jewish people. And those were the main followers of Paul. Well, they say that there's very little evidence of that. That actually, if you read the letters of Paul, he's talking to mostly ex-pagans, not people who are already heading towards Judaism, people who are actually far away from Judaism. And that's where the conflict begins, where what is he trying to do? Is he giving people an easy way to join the Jewish people through faith in Jesus? So is he like a reform or liberal Jew who's has a big tent approach? Or is he dismissing Jewish perspectives up to that point? Because really, the issue is that all Jews felt that people needed to convert to join the Jewish people, and he didn't. And he has his reasons for it. But now you have one gentleman, after the panoply of all Jews, including some of the relatives and disciples of Jesus who were there with him, like James and Peter. So now you have one mystic who's at war with all these other apostles and disciples. And then the question is, why is he so adamant that people who have joined his movement have less responsibilities or less covenantal restrictions as the rest of the Jewish people? And then at one point, it sounds like he's even saying that Jews shouldn't keep Torah or worry about that kind of stuff. And I've heard a lot of people say, well, he didn't really say that, you're misinterpreting stuff. But he goes as far as saying those people who push for circumcision, that it is like the main marker, like the ritual of entrance into the Jewish people as a baby and as an adult, that they should go ahead and castrate themselves. So I don't know if he's using soliloquy or he's using some type of prophetic utterance of disgust for people being too forceful. But it's this idea where now even the Jews who follow Jesus should not be so hardcore about Torah. So then the accusation that is made against him in the book of Acts, that he's teaching people to stop keeping the law of Moses, becomes questionable if it's true or not. Most people who follow Jewish Christian mentality would say that he was a faithful Jew, he was a descendant of the tribe of Benjamin, he was a disciple of Rabbanan Gamaliel, who's one of the greatest Torah scholars of all of Jewish history, even in Jewish circles. But it just seems like his mystical perspective, that I believe was very apocalyptic, had different provisions for Gentiles and even for Jews. Possibly he felt that at that time, due to either persecution or imminent return of his Messiah, that everything needed to be put on hold, and that spreading the message of the kingdom of God the way that he saw it was of the main importance. So now you move to rabbinic thought after the destruction of the temple and the community of Yavne, where the rabbis consolidated the Sanhedrin. They're talking about conversion more in maybe not completely in modern terms or up to the medieval standards of conversion, but they are talking about traditions that were passed down to them that sometimes can be a little fussy. We still don't know for sure what was the conversion process up to that point, but it seems to be, my mentor would be more of an expert on this, but it seems more to be matrilineal descent. And some people say that's actually a Roman rule, that the children of, you can tell whose children are from which woman as compared to which man. And when, so the women are also the ones that teach the children. So if it's a Jewish woman who has a kid, most likely the children will be raised Jewish as compared to being of a non-Jewish mother. But then for me, the conflict is that you see a lot of non-Jewish mothers in the Bible, such as, like I was saying, Zipporah, the wife of Joseph, Rahab, Ruth. So then what was the mechanism for them to join the Jewish people? And if Jewish Christians are correct and the mechanism was only to acquiesce to Jewish faith, then that is more in league with Paul as well as Maimonides. Because Maimonides had a very Greco-Roman perspective on religious obligations, and he felt that you can't really keep religious rituals and traditions and commandments without acquiescing faith in God first. So it's almost like a Paulinian thing that, if Abraham woke up and wanted to sacrifice his son, but he didn't get a chance to do it, his faith or his desire to be to keep the mitzvot is what saved him or redeemed him. And the Dead Sea Scroll community took the passage in Habakkuk that was used by Paul for that passage to mean something else. But Maimonides, in a sense, is saying that our faith in God is the foundation of our religious practice, and then you pull it up from there. Paul, on the other hand, said that your faith in God is everything. And James and other apostles said that it was important for you to keep the commandments, and I guess Paul focused more on the moral aspects of law, of the Jewish law. But it's all said and done, what's up with the Gentiles? How can a Gentile who's not willing to convert or who doesn't feel compelled to convert, how can they be in good standing before God from a Jewish perspective? And that's where the Noahide movement comes into play, because they take the rabbis mentioned that it was 7 laws that God gave through Noah, and as long as you keep those 7, you're in good standing before God as a Gentile. And there's a similar thing in Acts 15 in the New Testament, where they're given 4 commandments that they should follow, and then they can build up their knowledge of Hebrew scriptures from there. So it's a very complicated subject. We are teaching traditional Judaism, so we would support a more classical perspective where there has to be a Beit Din, there has to be some type of study program. There are friends that we have who believe that it should be a quick process, and then you kind of fill it in with time. And there's really, in the Talmud, it doesn't even say you need a rabbi. All you need is 2 witnesses who are knowledgeable of conversion, and then they've added that they should be kosher keeping and shomer mitzvot and shomer Shabbat. So with people who keep the commandments, who keep kosher, and who keep the Sabbath. But those are kind of extra. We always want to do our best. So then some people have added they have to be 3 rabbis. And in the document, you just have people sign. It's not that it can be issued by a synagogue, but so that's where people have found leeway on how do you convert to join the Jewish people. The biggest challenge, again, with crypto-Jews and for the Reform movement and for the so-called Messianic movement is that they have mixed marriages. And in the Bible, you have huge conflicts between Ezra and Nehemiah and the people. You have all kinds of conflicts with the Samaritans and other groups because the spouses are not Jewish. So to say, we're all a big happy family, and the women don't have to convert, or nobody has to convert, everybody's in, then that creates a lot of legal issues. It's almost like an immigration status where you can move to the country, you can speak the language, but if you haven't normalized your legal status, then it creates legal issues for the children. So, I used to work in legal immigration, and, if you have a child in Mexico and you have property in the US, you can't inherit the property over there or the other way around. So, in a sense, Jewish identity or Israelite identity we're heirs of that through our matrilineal lineage or through our spiritual identity. And for crypto Jews, there's a challenge, and we are making a case that you can reclaim that heritage through a halakhic process that we believe can be made, a case that can be made through minority responsum from different rabbis. There's actually quite a few. And then there's, the situation, the type of persecution that was that happened, and then slowly rectify the legal status of the children of the persecution, so the Bnei Anosim. Trini, I know I just dump a lot of information. You've been taking notes. Any questions or thoughts regarding that?
Well, the first question I have is, you mentioned the idea of the Beit Din. Within your circles right now, your current circles, do you have a Beit Din?
And that's the thing. I'm only willing to share so much on a recorded broadcast of our class. In the past, we have tried to help people. We've tried to create that, and sometimes it backfires because people are emotionally disturbed or have limited commitments to what we're trying to do. But again, Talmudically, all you need is 2 witnesses. And again, you can go from a spectrum of how kosher these witnesses are. So you can say, there are 2 Jews, 2 knowledgeable Jews, or 2 kosher Jews, and then all the way in between. And in there's articles about Reform rabbis who will use board members of a synagogue or other rabbis to convert people. Even conservative rabbis do that too. And that's why it can be questioned, because who are these people? The Orthodox use fellow rabbis. So then you have a stronger front to be able to create these documents. And now it's come to a point where no matter how Orthodox or how religious these people are, someone can always say, well, I don't know these people, or how do you know that they're truly kosher? So it's become silly and almost a battle between different Jewish groups. So we try to look at it from we're using the Talmud and the codes, Maimonides, Mishnah Torah, and Joseph Caro's Shulchan Aruch, to be able to make an informed decision on how to help you.
Okay. The other note I wrote down was, you mentioned an educational process for those who are looking to go through some conversion, right? Do you have some sort of educational institution in place already?
Well, the reason that we started this class, and the original class, was to teach some type of religious education for adults, which would be in collaboration with a curriculum to become, to build that Jewish identity. We started the class talking about Jewish law, about faith in God, about different historical things, and then we build it up to Jewish theology, and now we're discussing the book from Heschel to address all the issues that relate to a crypto-Jewish education, which would lead someone to have some type of return or conversion, in the sense of people put the cart before the horse. So they say, I need to convert. I need to do a return like Rabbi Joseph Garcia offers in Arizona. But what about the educational component of being able to have the knowledge and the understanding to actually be a Jew? Because a document can only give you so much. People think that once you have the document, you can walk into any synagogue and show them the document and you're in, and that's not true. And most likely because of our limitations, because we're trying to build something from scratch. We're not going to establish rabbis in America and telling them, help us in. We're coming in from our experience as crypto Jews and pushing forward. So we're building our scholars, our leaders, to be able to manage this movement and to build it up and to have all the right elements to create Jewish community. And we've also seen that having our own Jewish communities would create the type of environment where you're not questioned, where you're not mistreated, where you're not racially or ethnically discriminated. So then how do you do that? Well, you become knowledgeable on the sources. So if you're familiar with the Talmud and you're familiar with Jewish history and you're familiar with biblical and rabbinic thought, then you can build up not only the movement, the community, but the individuals. So then if whatever process they choose to do, and that's what I'm saying, this is educational. So if you choose to go with Rabbi Manny Viñas from, who now lives in Miami, I believe, he's very friendly towards crypto Jews, or you go with Rabbi Peter Tarlow from A&M and now Houston, or you go with Rabbi Joseph Garcia, they're going to have their own requirements. They're going to have their own way of doing things. But where do you go from there? And you should always have some type of mentoring program with your rabbi or your Beit Din. But since we are in the trenches, both speaking and presenting about the subject, talking and supporting different crypto Jews throughout Texas, our goal is to have a common front for all of us to be on the same page regarding what Jewish identity is, how Jewish law works, what is Jewish theology and how it relates, how other perspectives can be create problems or points even be destructive to the crypto-Jewish claim, and have that type of philosophical and spiritual support that people need to make it through this. Because again, if you come late in the game to Jewish identity, then there's a lot of repercussions that come with it. You have familial conflict, you have even spiritual struggles that come with it, you have debates with friends and people that you love regarding your approach that you're taking. So there's more to it than just going with one Beit Din or one rabbi and trying to fix the problem. And all the movements say that as long as you come with them and you support them somehow, they'll support you. But for Hispanics, it's always been an upward challenge. Like it's been a struggle to actually integrate and to join and be accepted as fellow Jews. So we keep our approach is a benefit of the doubt perspective, where we had on the YouTube, we have a gentleman from who's a descendant of crypto Jews, but he's been part of the Jewish community for a long time, and he was saying that the legal process should not be you prove that you're Jewish. It should be the other way around. Can they disprove that someone is Jewish? Because it's on them, and that's the Maimonidean approach, is that you give people your confidence, and then the proof is in the pudding. The way they live their lives, the way that they embrace Judaism, that's how you work with them, instead of misjudging and dismissing people immediately like a lot of groups do. What other question did you have, Trini?
Well, in my case, I'd like to focus on myself.
Sure.
The idea of whether or not I even consider myself crypto Jewish. or of any kind, of any sort. I have never come to that conclusion on myself. Okay, I know what I heard people say, and I know I've read people who talk about crypto-Judaism. I have my own book here that's called The Secrecy Descent or something like, or Secrecy or Deceit, something, a book
David
called that.
Euclid's book, yeah.
Yeah. And I've read so much about it because I thought maybe I could be, you know.
Right.
But I haven't found a way to verify anything like that. So do you guys, have you all come to some sort of perspective, position on how do crypto or potential crypto Jews come out of the closet?
Well, if you hear my lecture at the genealogical conference in San Antonio, I talk about that, about like how do you go from a crypto Jew to a real Jew, or an out of the closet Jew, and the idea is that you have your own journey and you have your own quest for that, and we're not going to tell people what to do, in the sense of, like, if someone feels that there's not enough there, like in their history or through their genealogy or whatever method they use to find out about their ancestry, that if they need a conversion to feel like, I went from a nothing to something, then that's wonderful. Conversion is a legitimate way to become Jewish. If someone finds out enough information and then they want to join the Jewish people, that's where it gets sticky legally in a Jewish perspective, because there's different berachot, there's different blessings for someone who left and came back, and someone who's never been part of the Jewish people. So if you say, if you call someone a son of Abraham, they're a son of Abraham. In the rabbinic thought, a son of Abraham is someone who has been almost like spiritually joined to the Jewish people. But if you come from a Jewish ancestry, then you're a son of your father, because the idea is that your father would be Jewish, or your father was Gentile and your mother is Jewish. So then I don't know how that works. I don't know if you would be Abraham because of your father not being Jewish. But so the point is that there's a lineage that comes from being part of the persecuted people of Latin America, and that's what, it's a broken history. We have limited information, but stuff was burned. Kind of like destruction of the temple, they burn all the records. So if you read the Bible, it gives you all these genealogies. Well, whatever genealogies after that, they don't have that information. So we're running into the same problem. I met people that say that they can prove that they're descendants of whoever, and it's like, okay, well, if you claim that you can go all the way back to Columbus, that's fantastic, because very few people can do that. And there's a gentleman from Colombia who was able to prove that one of the sailors that left Spain and ended up in Latin America was his ancestor, and the conservative movement that his wife was part of, or his future bride, forced him to convert just in case. So even if you can show that your ancestors were conversos, or not everybody was converso, there was people who were just still Jewish, they hadn't committed themselves to Catholicism, and they fled or they became pirates, and then they ended up in wherever. People are still going to say, well, I don't trust it, I don't believe it, and then they force people to do something else. So it's just whatever way that someone finds that fortitude to be able to weather the storm, because you are going to have people question you, you're going to have people dismiss you. And then if you have small children or a young family, it's more challenging than if you are older and your children are grown up, because everybody's already made up their mind on where they want to go. So to be accepted as a Jew by a fellow group of crypto-Jews or descendants of Anusim can be a very satisfying thing for an individual. But like I said, when we've tried to help people in the past, they don't want that. They want to be accepted by the chief rabbi of Israel. Well, if you want to be accepted by the chief rabbi of Israel, go with him and talk to him and convert through him, and then you got what you wanted. But they demand things, and they're not willing to follow up with their demands. So, but it's a different journey for different peoples. And some people say it's a very spiritual journey where God tells you, or God leads you in the right path. other people is more a genealogical thing, and for other people is more historical thing. And somewhere in there is like your relatives told you of some traditions or told you specifically that you are a descendant of Jews who were persecuted. So it's different for every person. And someone can say, well, I know this and you don't, so then you're not in, but I am. And that's just ridiculous because it's a challenging thing. You know, persecution took away a lot of the information that we need to make a case, but you can still make a case from a lot of the kind of periphery, what is it? The surrounding evidence, not the, you know, like the proof, but there's surrounding evidence to make a case.
You mentioned the Shulchan Aruch and Responsum. This is very traditional, right? This is the totally fundamentally traditional Jewish perspective.
Yes, and just to clarify, go ahead.
Well, my question is more about, because there's two, from what I can tell, there's the Crypto-Jews. I'm not sure if they were Sephardic or if they were Ashkenaz. So
which ones? Your ancestors or just in general?
Just in general. I'm asking in general.
Okay.
Were Crypto-Jews mostly Sephardic?
Well, there's Crypto-Jews in a lot of different communities. There's a guy, he's an Orthodox guy from Israel, and he says that there's Crypto-Jews in Afghanistan, and there's Crypto-Jews in India, and there's Crypto-Jews in Africa. And he calls them the 12 tribes. And the 12 tribes is a myth. It's not that we never had 12 tribes, it's just the 12 tribes were reunified after the first exile. So this idea that there's Jews everywhere and they're all hiding is a little far-fetched. But there are people who were forcibly converted to Islam, forcibly converted to Catholicism in Italy, in France, in possibly Afghanistan and other places, or people who went all the way to China and Japan and they still practice Judaism, or some of them integrated to the rest of the people. So that's one issue. So there's people who could be Crypto-Jews from anywhere. The Shulchan Aruch is the latest code that is believed by most Jews or followed. And up until the 1700s, there was only one form of Judaism, and that was traditional Judaism. A lot of French groups online, they'll say that the Karaites are a legitimate group of Jews, or that some other strange group can compete against traditional classical Judaism, but the numbers are not there. So if you have a group that has 10,000 members, and then we have, and they can say, well, which group is bigger, and that's how you know which one you follow. Well, it's not really about size. It's more about which group actually has a more consistent claim in history, being in leadership within the Jewish world. And then you have sects and groups that break away. So, but there's also not a direct line all the way to Moses in the sense of orthodoxy, as some people might claim. The Orthodox idea is also a brand new perspective, and relatively, so 300 years, where they hunkered down because people were coming up with enlightened ideas that were changing the infrastructure. So, but the Shulchan Aruch doesn't, as far as I know, doesn't really talk about Crypto-Jews, but it is the source of, how do you keep kosher? How do you follow the laws of purity and things like that? And you can look at the Mishnah Torah and you can look at the Talmud, but they're all derivatives of each other. So
can you touch on what is this deal between a Sephardic synagogue service versus an Ashkenaz?
You mean deal or difference?
I mean, are they not different?
Well, they're somewhat different, but the basic service is the same. Like sometimes the prayers are moved from one section to another, or they don't have as many blessings. But the main aspects of the prayer are the same. And there's groups like they have taken traditions from each other. If you go to Chabad, they use Sephardic influence Siddur, even though they're Ashkenazim, and it's because it's more mystical and they like the mystical stuff. And you have other places that are more dry or more rational. And but when it all comes down to it, it's if you know Hebrew, you can go to almost any synagogue around the world and you would be able to participate. So that's why we push for learning Hebrew, and it's something that we have in common. And one of the reasons that the Muslims and the Christians used Jewish doctors or Jewish philosophers to do their bidding, or even merchants, was because they were able to communicate with communities all around the Mediterranean using the common language of Hebrew. So that's something that the Moroccans and the Arabs and the North Europeans were not able to communicate with other groups most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I wanted to see in your question about the crypto Jews being from different places. What was the point of that?
Well, no, the point was really more about whether or not crypto Jews were mostly Sephardic or not.
Well, there is a myth that goes around in the Ashkenazi community that all the Jews who were going to be forcibly converted during the Crusades and during the persecutions in Europe, Northern Europe, they all rather were willing to die or kill themselves than to convert, and that is not true. There was cases where people actually converted to Catholicism, like the people in Spain, and then they survived. We don't know if they came back or not, but not everybody was a hero in that perspective. And then in my paper about Maimonides, I talk about how it's actually against Jewish law to commit suicide. So they're not as big heroes as they're painted to be because it's problematic. And there are some people who believe that the story of Masada, where there was major martyrdom or mass suicide, is actually it's an exaggerated account because of the same reason, that killing yourself does not help in any way. There are people who were murdered by the Romans. Rabbi Akiva was wrapped in a Torah scroll and they set him on fire. And that's he's seen as a great martyr of the faith, but you cannot do that willingly. You cannot, come kill me kind of thing. So, and it's interesting that you look what happened to Jesus. There's this thing about did he allow it to happen, or did it happen because of his enemies, or it was mandated by God? So it kind of it's part of the Jewish experience. How do you deal with persecution? Do you fight back? Do you let yourself get killed? By letting yourself killed, are you glorifying God? If you're getting killed for Torah, it's different than you're getting killed because of political reasons. So it's a more complicated thing that everybody who you should just let yourself get killed to not blaspheme God by keeping the commandments of a different faith. And then there's people who say that Christianity in itself is not pagan or foreign worship because the original premise of Christianity is monotheism. Whatever they've done with it, that's one thing, but the original premise is not as problematic as other religions.
Yeah.
So I know it's a lot, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation because I feel that we haven't touched on everything during our classes, and it needs to be discussed. And the reason that we're studying Heschel and Jewish law and Agadah or biblical narrative is how do you tie it all together? So if you are having spiritual struggles, or if you feel disenfranchised, then the more you know, the more you're able to integrate that into your life. So Judaism is very vast, and it's easy to get to drown in it. So people get overwhelmed. They're like, I don't want nothing to do with it. It's too much. But it's a beautiful religion that has a lot of resources and alternatives to be able to kind of make it work for yourself. Alejandra, do you have any questions from what we're talking about?
Actually, no, I don't have any questions. I'm just listening into the conversation.
So, but Alejandra, we've been talking offline about multiple identities, and this is something I mentioned in my presentation at the genealogical conference. Is that on one side we do have multiple identities because whether Spanish, Portuguese, Native Mexican, or whatever other group came through, and then we are Hispanic, Mexican, American. And we have multiple things that we're interested in, multiple things that define who we are. So it's easy to just pick a side and it's like, I'm gonna be this, and I don't care what anybody thinks. But being accepted by that community, being seen as a member, we just had the Elizabeth Warren situation where she's sharing her background, and the people that she wants to be associated with don't accept her because there's a process that you have to follow. And the more involved you're in a community, the more they'll accept you. And then will they even I had a friend who she joined a tribe in Tennessee, and jokingly I said, oh, so now you're native. And she's like, I can never be native. You have to be full-blooded, or you have to be born into it. And I'm like, well, that's not very helpful, because if Judaism was only through lineage, and then we would be dying off because of intermarriage, because of assimilation, because of people not being interested in keeping the tradition alive. So in the same case, if a small tribe does not have a process of integration into their community, then how are they going to be able to survive the test of time? And if their children don't want to participate, they're still members, but not really. And that's the debate that Maimonides had. Go ahead.
I would think, in my personal opinion, that would revolve around actually trying to reach out to people that really want to actually hear what you have to say in regards to that subject. I personally feel that there's a lot of healing that needs to be done in both the communities, because if it wasn't needed, there wouldn't be such a discord amongst not just the Orthodox Jewish community, but there is also an Orthodox, Native community and an Orthodox Christian community. And if we could just kind of try to help people see past that torn veil, I think that would be more beneficial than just, I don't know, just maybe more beneficial than just sitting there and pretending like you can't see what's like really going on. I guess it would be my main concern. You know what I mean? Like, there's so many people out there that, like, okay, you eat the meat that bread every day. Like, we know that. But, like, what does that really mean to you? Do you know the history behind that? Do you know the history behind what you're doing? Like, when you say happy birthday, I know there's, like, a lot of music that rings through to people in Spanish that really has a more connection with the Jewish community than most people really think. And I think as long as you don't know that you keep your eyes covered. Or if maybe you've been lied to your whole life about certain things that you've been taught to believe, then that creates an issue for you as well. And it's having to find the proper people to make a difference in that aspect.
Well, there's something I wanted to share. Alejandra, tell me what you think about this. Maimonides, who's one of the greatest Jewish philosophers and Spanish members of the Jewish community, he felt that this idea that if you're born Jewish, you're Jewish, and nobody can take that away. He actually had problems with that. I agree with
that 100%.
Well, but we got to look at it because the Jewish community is sensitive about this. So I was talking to Trini about how the Apostle Paul was saying that the children of Abraham are those who have the faith of Abraham. Well, Maimonides, who was also a philosopher and influenced by Greek cultures, just like Apostle Paul, he said that you're an Israelite by birth, but you're a Jew by faith. So if you're born Jewish, that's wonderful, but how does it actually, how do you actualize your identity? Because you've been...
I think that would be an actual personal experience between you and the creator of the universe, because only he can really personally call you out by name. Like, I know so many people, you know, that you might look at them, you might think they're this or they're that, but like, I mean, I can use all kinds of things for an instance, like including myself, like, you know what I mean? Like, I never thought in my life that I would be learning Hebrew or that I would understand Torah or that I would understand anything. But I think that it takes a personal relationship or wanting to have that relationship. It's just something that comes from, you know, God really just calling you from where you're at the time that you're at. You know what I mean? It's kind of hard to explain, but at the same time, it's really just not that complicated.
Well, then that's the case that Kabbalists and other mystical Jews would make against Maimonides, because what we're really dealing with is not personal spirituality. We're dealing with world religions, and world religions have gone through a process of evolution. So you have people who maybe in the Bible, like we were talking about Ruth, she had an experience with a Jewish or an Israelite woman, and he was that was her mentor or her mother-like figure, and then she had
And a Jewish husband.
Yeah, an Israelite husband. And
was that Boaz?
No.
Well, Boaz was her second husband. Her first husband was the son of Naomi.
Yes.
So the son of Naomi left her without children and without a family, and then she was trying to figure out how can she keep going, and then she meets Naomi and Boaz, and she's redeemed, she's brought back to the fold, and then she has a spiritual experience in the process. So that's one perspective. Then you have the mystical perspective from the medieval times, where they say that all Jewish souls were there at Sinai when the commandments were given, because they said we will do and we will keep. So they were making a proclamation that through the generations we would be faithful to the Torah. So there's this mystical aspect of it. So then,
right?
Maimonides says that you're Jew legally by being birthed through a Jewish mother, and then you become Jewish spiritually by accepting the existence of God and living out the covenant. They're saying that people who automatically feel compelled to do that in whatever legal way they address their lack of status.
I agree with that. I agree with that, because sometimes you are limited with the information that you have. And unfortunately for us crypto Jews who have lived with the Inquisition and who are the byproducts of such an atrocity, we have to remember that a lot of things were kept through not necessarily secrecy, absolutely secrecy, but sometimes in just a way that was just so simple that it was just so easy to understand. Like, why wouldn't you want to break bread with anybody? You know what I mean? Like, that would be my personal take on it. And that's where I kind of come in and say that tradition has been broken down and taken apart and reassembled in such a way to fit everybody's, you know, spiritual narrative. But the way that I see it personally is that if your spiritual narrative does not fit with the 13 principles of Hashem or fit within the Torah perspective of even a Noahide or a Gur, I mean, there was like people that were even there before the Noahide movement and before so many of these other movements and in so many different places. It's just kind of hard to kind of pinpoint and say who doesn't really belong. But I personally, I would take like a whole stance with the Torah, and like I wouldn't take a stance against God if I was from any type of tribe or any type of culture or anything like that. that to me wouldn't be right.
Well, but that's why we're discussing, God's revelation. Because in other spiritual traditions, they try to define God, and they try to say, well, you know that you are a believer, a follower of God, if you believe these, things. And Maimonides said the 13 principles that you mentioned, but the God of creation, the God that is revealed through Scripture, is a God that cannot be contained by people or doctrines or things like that. So we can apprehend, we can have an idea of who God is, but we can't fully comprehend, the King of the universe. So people become arrogant and they say, well, I have figured out who God is. And
well, then they need to go back to like Torah 101. Like,
right.
If you really have somebody that really thinks that in their mental perspective, then I think they have a lot to learn.
But then the debate is, has God placed in the world a system, an institution, to be able to regulate behavior?
Absolutely. And those are called his mitzvahs. And he gave us 613 of those to communicate with him.
So then,
and I think one of the major points that needs to be addressed in our community is how can we help our community fulfill these mitzvahs that are in some sort of a way kind of like hidden and keeping away from them. There's positive mitzvahs and there's negative mitzvahs. And there's negative mitzvahs, there's like, okay, well, you know what, I'm not this, so I can't keep that. And I'm kind of grateful for those type of mitzvahs, because one mitzvah adds on like 10 mitzvahs, in my opinion at least. I don't know. I mean, that's just my perspective.
What did you mean by that?
I mean, like, Hashem gives us 613 ways that we can talk to him and be connected with him. And I don't think that at any point in time in life I'm going to ever be able to complete 613 mitzvahs, because a lot of them don't apply to me. And I think that being educated in the mitzvahs that you can actually apply to your life and in your circumstances, those are the ones that need to be addressed to certain people's communities. I mean, I don't know.
Well, let me give you an example. So when you start keeping kosher, let's say that you go to Walmart to buy your food, half of the stuff they sell at Walmart is already kosher. Candy's kosher, yes. Cookies are kosher, potato chips. So someone can get really stressed out and say, oh, well, I can't keep kosher because there's so much that's crazy. And then you realize that half of the stuff you buy is already kosher. So now you got to kind of take it to the next level. It's like, how do I make it 75% kosher or up to 100? And 100% kosher is more complicated than just buying the food kosher, but it's the idea that we're halfway there, instead of people being like, oh, well, I'm never eaten like that, so I'm not even going to try.
Well, that's because they don't know the holiness that comes behind trying to keep that type of mitzvah. Like, you don't have to know everything all up front. Like, you can just say, you know what, I don't want to eat a hamburger with cheese today. Or I don't want to eat pepperoni at all. Or you can just say, like, whatever you want, and then just keep that for that day, and just be serious about it. I mean, it takes a lot. It's not easy. I don't know anybody that has ever kept it perfect. I know I'm not one that keeps it perfect. I know in my situation and where I'm at, I have to keep it at least clean for certain people that are coming to get products. It's just, you just take it like one thing at a time, and perfect that one thing at a time. I don't see why it always has to be. I think there's nothing wrong with the perfection of the mitzvah. Don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think in dealing with people who don't have access to all these things, that have all these symbols and signs and scratchings and emblems on them that they can't afford, like certain things shouldn't necessarily be placed on them, but I think that they still can be welcomed into the Jewish community. And I think it's in part in knowing how to approach those types of situations. Like, I get asked all the time, hey, can you come over here? We're going to cook. And I'm like, oh my God, I don't really want to eat the food. And then I feel so rude. And then I give them, my self-anxiety because I don't want to be around that type of situation. I just think it's what you can do when you can't do it. And if I don't want to eat, I'm not going to eat it. I promise you.
Yeah, but you run into more problems if you go to a lot of Mexican events, you're always going to run into the issue where they put pork in every item of food. So
depends. It depends on what kind of Mexicans you run into. You do have those Mexicans that are like, oh, who cares, blah, 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 la, 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 and they play Vicente Fernandez. But then you have those kind of Mexicans that, like, when you hear Las Mañanitas, who really know what that actually means when it comes to when they hear that song. Because if you actually ever really heard that song, you would hear that it's sung to the King of David.
Well, tell me more about your perspective on that song, because part of the song is that the birds will sing and the flowers will bloom when you're baptized. So
I don't know if it's about baptism, but I think it's more about like, hey, you know what? You had another day to wake up and look at this. You have these birds that sing to you. Look at this. These flowers, they look like you. Look at this. The world is coming to say good morning to you. It's not necessarily about anything else to me. And either I can say it to you in Spanish or...
Have you heard a theory about it having a crypto-Jewish background? I know the part about King David, and it's strange because...
I never heard the theory. But I have heard the song.
Well, I want to agree with you that it is possibly of Jewish origin, because I have a friend who's a Greek Orthodox, and I said, hey, can you give me some paintings of the patriarchs? They make these icons, and they have, they're supposed to have an icon of Moses, an icon of Abraham or King David, and they're like, oh, we really don't sell those. We usually sell icons, images of Jesus or the Virgin Mary or something like that. So even though they have in the Old Testament, where with all the Jewish prophets and characters, they de-emphasize it. So for a Mexican song to emphasize King David, it is kind of strange.
What I will say in regards to that, that I have personally been taught by my mother, is never to jingle your golden chain. And what she always meant to me by that was like, it doesn't matter like what you're wearing, because I remember a time in my life when I used to wear like rosarios and this and that, and she was like, man, don't get caught slipping. And that's what my mom was trying to tell me. I personally don't think it's really intelligent to kind of do things like that. I wouldn't say intelligent, but it probably wouldn't be really wise to get caught wearing certain things like that, even if it is Moshe, even if it is Abraham, Rahab, even if it is, I don't know, Queen Esther, I don't care. Because if the moment that you get caught sinning or doing something against what those things represent, you are absolutely in the wrong, and there's a really, like, you just can't be taken seriously. And that's kind of what my mom was trying to tell me. Like, you can't be taken seriously if you're wearing that stuff and you do something stupid. And trust me, my poor mom, she had to deal with so much with me, it's not even funny. But that's where that comes from, in my opinion.
Well, Trini and I were saying that whatever the Orthodox people do from whatever tradition, that's one thing, and whatever we do and however we help our people is something else. So I never want to pick fights with other groups of Jews, but I do want to make a differentiation that there's people who are very closed, and they only focus on what they do and how they do it, and like you talked about perfectionism. And then there's people who are working with their population. So there's people in the past who have converted, and they come from a particular ethnic group, and then they go join a synagogue that is a different ethnic group, and it's awkward. Like they can't fit in. So the same thing goes for us building our own synagogues and building our own communities where we can have people who understand our perspective. And we're from all different shades and all different sizes. And we're also trying to break the stereotypes of what a Jew looks like. Because again, there's been multiple generations. And one time I met a blonde, blue-eyed Jew from Monterrey, where I'm from. And I asked him, do you think that is it possible that there's crypto Jews, or I can't remember exactly what I said, but his response was,
Like, seriously, like, how lucky were you to meet like another Jew in Monterey?
well, we were actually in Boston, but this was a guy from Monterrey who was studying in Harvard, and I asked him, what do you think? And he said, do you think that Moses looked like me? And I was like, no. And he's like, exactly. So to assume that every Jew looks like a Eastern European Jew is ridiculous, because how is it that Moses stayed hidden as a Hebrew within the Egyptians if he didn't look like them? So the Egyptians back then look different than the Egyptians now. Egyptians now are mostly from the Arab countries, but the original Egyptians, you can see it in the statues and the paintings, they look like from there. So this idea that the Jews were Charlton Heston or something like that, it doesn't fly. And there's just somebody posted a ridiculous video there's another class that we're starting, and he's posting that his leader is from a certain race, and there's no evidence of that. So you can say, what are these people can look at this video and say, what are we doing? Why are we trying to build a Jewish identity for people who are of Latino heritage? And it's because we have a history that connects us. And what I was trying to talk about, one of the challenges that they had with Elizabeth Warren was, your history is different than your tribal affiliation. We're trying to have both. We're trying to have not only a Jewish history or ancestry, or that we're part of the plight and the persecution of Jews through Latin America, but we're also building our communities. So we're not asking anybody.
I think that was. I just really honestly think, like, in that perspective, to me, that boils down to tribe perspective. But that comes into a lot of different situations that you run into, because you have Jews that take in DNA tests that's like 2%. And that's how they found their Jewishness, and that's how they came back to Torah. And you have Jews that always had the oral Torah, but they don't necessarily really associate with the community that they participate in, but they've always had a love or a reverence for it. And I think it just depends on each individual person, you know what I mean? Because it just goes right back to me saying that, God, quote unquote, he calls us out purposely and for whatever reason he wants to call us out in. And I don't necessarily think that Elizabeth Warren is a liar. I think that she did it according to her tribal decency, and she was polite about it. She didn't abuse anything. I don't see why anybody would sit around and accuse somebody like that about that. And that seems to be the same issue with, like, Jewish people. And also, conversos and cryptos, they come along with this same problem every time. You have one that's 100%, but they don't have Torah, and then you have one that is like, 2% and is like totally kosher, and it just depends, I guess, on what narrative you would like to have somebody fit in that would make the difference.
Well, we have to wrap it up, Alejandra, but can you tell us briefly your experience with DNA? In the presentation I did with in San Antonio, I spoke about how I don't agree with DNA. I think there's actually a waste of money. But tell us, how did doing your DNA gear you in the right direction?
Well, actually, doing my DNA is a really long history behind it. I don't think that I have enough time for. But I would like to say about DNA is that it has totally reshape my outlook of life. Like, I feel like I understand things a lot better. You know what I mean? Like, it also clarifies things for me, and at the same time, it makes me a relative to a lot of other things that I'd never think that I was relative to. It's really opened up my horizons, and it helped me find my Jewish ancestry and it solidified everything that I believed in 100% and more than what I was expecting.
Okay, and there's a
And
lady.
I've been able to understand other people because of it too. You know what I mean? I have Black friends who speak nothing but Spanish. I have Chinese friends that come from Germany who speak nothing but Spanish, and just different things. And it just helps me see the beauty in everything. So I don't know.
Well, next time, I'm trying to get in touch with a lady from New Mexico who found out about her Jewish ancestry, and she's a speaker for Jewish Gen. It's the major genealogical group on Facebook, and she goes around the world speaking about how it all fits in. So maybe next time I can interview her and have that as our class, so when we can kind of see how does that work for some people. But we'll get back to the Heavenly Torah pretty soon. Again, we're like a support group for people from our experience, and we have to tackle every single element of our identity. I feel that some groups, they only focus on Jewish law, or they only focus on spirituality. We're trying to address everything: cultural, social, emotional, everything, and is part of the struggle. So I'm glad that you guys are faithful supporters of this class. Go ahead, Alejandra.
Can I please have some more information on like Jewish education, or if I can have somebody reach out to me in regards to that? I'm just kind of want to see what my options are.
What exactly are you asking?
Maybe some sort of guidance through like college education, or something that I can get a degree in. It's something that I'm kind of looking towards.
Well, we work in collaboration with the Bernier Sim Center for Education. It's available on www.cryptojudaiseducation.com. Is the website of Rabbi Bejarano Gutierrez, who's my mentor and the author in many books we discuss. And he has like literally 1,000 articles. So if you're interested in educating yourself about this whole experience, those articles are of great value, and then you can ask us questions. At this point, there might be it might be like an associate's or a minor in crypto-Jewish studies somewhere in New Mexico. There's a gentleman that we met who leads that program, but again, it's all what you do with it. So we encourage people to get a traditional or a basic master's or bachelor's in Jewish studies, and then build up from there. Because we've had people who focus on certain parts of the Sephardic experience, but we should have the whole smorgasbord of Jewish experience, and then be able to build from there. But the rabbi's website, again, CryptoJudaisEducation.com, is a great resource. And then the more people are knowledgeable about what we're talking about, the more we're able to stand our ground and have the ability to share our experience with others. I want to thank you guys for being part of the class or for watching the recording, and we'll see you next week here again on this class. Thank you. Okay. How you doing, Trini?
I'm okay. I'm gonna have to leave though.